Tonight, the topic we explore is the life of Queen Elizabeth I, the woman who defied marriage, ruled with unmatched resolve, and gave her name to an entire era. From the shadow of execution as a princess to the golden light of triumph as a queen, her reign reshaped England forever. A ruler, a symbol, and a mystery, Elizabeth I stands among the most iconic monarchs in history. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel only if you enjoy our content. And let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Sometimes the stories we tell are so interesting that they keep us up, and other times we're working on some boring ones for just that reason. Now, it's time to dim the lights, turn on a fan for some soft white noise, and join us as we gently unfold the life, loves, and legacies of the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth Tudor. The year was 1533, and the air in Greenwich Palace buzzed with anxious expectation. King Henry VIII, desperate for a male heir, awaited the arrival of his second child. His new wife, Anne Boleyn, had captivated England, clever, ambitious, and defiant. But when the midwives delivered a baby girl on September 7th, silence fell over the court. The longed-for son had not arrived. Instead, a daughter, Elizabeth. Her birth was not celebrated with the grandeur of a future queen. It was, to many, a political failure. But to her mother Anne, and to a few loyal supporters, Elizabeth was precious. The infant princess had fiery red hair and a sharp, curious gaze. She bore her father's Tudor blood and her mother's bold spirit. What no one yet realized was that this small child, born into disappointment, would one day command an empire. Elizabeth's early years were not easy. When she was not yet 3, her world turned dark. Her mother, once queen, was arrested, accused of adultery and treason, and taken to the Tower of London. Days later, Anne Boleyn was executed, beheaded by sword. Elizabeth, now the daughter of a disgraced woman, was declared illegitimate and stripped of her title. The royal cradle was replaced by a quiet life in the countryside. She was watched more than she was loved. Moved between households, her royal blood kept her in privilege, but her mother's fall kept her in danger. Her father, Henry VIII, married again, and Elizabeth watched, silent and observant, as wives were crowned, discarded, or destroyed. But Elizabeth did not fade. She listened. She learned. Her education was entrusted to the finest scholars, and she absorbed Latin, French, and philosophy with astonishing speed. She read of empires, saints, and kings. Even in childhood, she showed signs of something rare: resilience wrapped in intelligence. Though she had been born into scandal and loss, Elizabeth began to shape herself into something greater. Not just a survivor of her mother's tragedy, but a student of it. She understood what power could do, what love could cost, what silence could protect. And deep inside, the fire of her future reign quietly began to burn. As Elizabeth grew into a young girl, her world remained unpredictable, shaped by the whims of a volatile court and the ever-changing moods of a father she barely knew. But even in this world of danger, she learned to adapt, not by force, but by watching, listening, waiting. While others fought for position, Elizabeth became a master of stillness. She paid attention to how words were used as weapons, how smiles could hide betrayal. Her mind became her fortress, and inside it, she stored every lesson. Her education continued to flourish. Elizabeth read the works of Cicero and Seneca, absorbing the logic of ancient Rome and the grace of classical poetry. She wrote letters in Latin, translated Greek texts, and spoke French and Italian with near-perfect fluency. More than just a noblewoman in waiting, she was becoming one of the most intellectually gifted women in Europe. But knowledge alone couldn't protect her. When her half-brother Edward ascended the throne, Elizabeth kept her head low. And when her half-sister Mary, fiercely Catholic and suspicious of all Protestants, became queen, Elizabeth's life entered a new phase of danger. Whispers surrounded her. Some believed she conspired with Protestant rebels. Others thought she secretly wished to take the throne. In 1554, when a rebellion erupted against Queen Mary, Elizabeth was implicated. She was taken to the Tower of London. The same stone walls that had once held her mother now closed around her. For weeks, she lived with the fear that she might never leave alive. The cold halls of the tower echoed with silence, interrupted only by the creak of footsteps, the distant sound of ravens, and her own quiet prayers. But still, she did not break. Elizabeth denied every accusation with measured clarity. She wrote carefully worded letters to the Queen, denying treason while never seeming too confident. She cried when needed, stayed calm when expected, and allowed her silence to speak louder than outrage ever could. Eventually, she was released, but not because she was believed. She had simply become too dangerous to kill and too careful to condemn. When she walked out of the tower, Elizabeth was no longer just a princess with a claim. She was a woman forged in suspicion, sharpened by survival. And her time was coming. The year was 1558, and the bells of London tolled for the death of Queen Mary. The land was quiet with anticipation. After decades of religious strife, burnings, executions, and unrest, the people looked to a new sovereign. A woman once imprisoned in the Tower, once branded illegitimate, was now to wear the crown. Elizabeth Tudor, just 25 years old, was proclaimed Queen of England. She rode through the capital streets on a white horse, the November air sharp with the scent of wood smoke and change. The people cheered, tossing their caps and kneeling in muddy streets. She smiled, radiant and composed, but inside she knew the weight she now bore. England was divided. The treasury was nearly bankrupt. Foreign enemies circled, and many still doubted that a woman could rule alone. But Elizabeth had prepared for this moment her entire life. Her coronation on January 15th, 1559, was a pageant of gold, velvet, and incense. She walked into Westminster Abbey dressed in white and crimson, crowned beneath the ancient arches of kings. And yet, there was something different in her reign from the very start, a sense of resolve, of clarity, of control. One of her first decisions was to restore the Church of England, breaking once more from Rome. But she did it with care. She did not launch mass persecutions or inflame tensions. Instead, she sought compromise. She wanted peace, not fanaticism. She assembled a council of trusted advisers. William Cecil became her most loyal servant, brilliant, steady, and wise. Others, like Francis Walsingham and Nicholas Bacon, formed the backbone of her government. These men understood her vision, a stable England, ruled not by fear, but by intelligence and restraint. And then there was the question that would never go away: marriage. Parliament urged her to choose a husband. Foreign courts sent proposals. Princes and dukes were presented like rare gifts. But Elizabeth refused, not rudely, not hastily. She simply never said yes. She once told her advisers, "I am already bound unto a husband, which is the kingdom of England." She would rule alone. In a world where women were expected to follow, Elizabeth had chosen to lead. And though the road ahead would be lined with enemies, threats, and heartbreak, she had already made the most important decision of her reign. She would never share the crown. From the moment she wore the crown, Elizabeth became the most sought-after bride in Europe. Not for love, but for alliance, control, and power. Kings and princes, dukes and noblemen lined up to win her hand. Each proposal carried with it the weight of diplomacy. A marriage to Elizabeth could shift the balance of Europe. But she remained unmarried. One name rose above the rest: Robert Dudley, handsome, charming, and ever present at Elizabeth's side. They had known each other since childhood. He was one of the few who could make her laugh. Whispers at court speculated endlessly about the nature of their bond. His wife's sudden and suspicious death only deepened the rumours. And yet, Elizabeth did not marry him. She did not marry anyone. There were many suitors over the years. Philip II of Spain, once married to her sister Mary. the Archduke Charles of Austria, Francis, Duke of Anjou. Each man represented a possible alliance. Each courtship was drawn out, sometimes for years, only to end in diplomatic silence. Elizabeth played the game carefully. She used the promise of marriage as a diplomatic tool, never rejecting outright, but never surrendering control. She kept foreign rulers hopeful, while keeping their ambitions at bay. It was a delicate balance, and she mastered it. At home, her choice not to marry made her a curiosity, even a source of anxiety. A queen without a king, a woman ruling alone, and above all, a woman without an heir. Still, she crafted a new identity, the Virgin Queen. She transformed what others saw as a weakness into a symbol of divine purpose. Paintings began to depict her not just as a monarch, but as a myth, draped in pearls, bathed in light, untouched by earthly concerns. She belonged not to any man, but to England. In truth, the choice was both personal and political. Elizabeth had seen too clearly what marriage could cost, how it could weaken a queen, make her vulnerable, or worse, allow another to rule in her name. She valued her sovereignty too much. So she walked alone. And with every year, that decision echoed more powerfully. Elizabeth was not just England's ruler. She was its bride. As Elizabeth's reign deepened, her court blossomed into something extraordinary. More than a seat of governance, it became a stage, where wit, poetry, art, and ambition all danced beneath the Queen's gaze. It was a theatre of power, and Elizabeth was its leading lady. The court at Whitehall and Richmond glittered with silk and gold. Courtiers arrived dressed in the latest fashions, ruffled collars, jewelled sleeves, and velvet robes. Yet beneath the shimmer, a quiet competition brewed. Every look, every gesture, every carefully chosen word was a move in a larger game, to win the Queen's favour. Elizabeth encouraged it. She loved spectacle. Masks, dances, and elaborate entertainments filled the royal calendar. Poets like Edmund Spenser wrote verses in her honour. Painters immortalised her in portraits as mythic and ageless, with symbolic pearls, celestial globes, and serene expressions. These were not just flattery, they were propaganda, carefully crafted to reinforce her power. And then, of course, there was William Shakespeare. Though he never performed directly for Elizabeth in his early years, his work rose alongside the golden age she nurtured. His plays explored ambition, betrayal, love, and fate, themes she knew all too well. But court life was not all elegance and artistry. It was also dangerous. Beneath the surface, rivalries brewed, factions formed, spies listened. Elizabeth maintained control with remarkable finesse. She never married, yet she played favourites, raising men like Robert Dudley, Walter Raleigh, and the Earl of Essex to great heights, only to cast them down when they overreached. Still, she rewarded loyalty and brilliance. Her closest advisers remained constant, especially William Cecil, her backbone in policy and planning. With his help, she maintained a delicate balance, allowing just enough freedom to keep the court vibrant, but never enough to threaten her throne. Though the pressures of rule were immense, Elizabeth rarely showed weakness. Even as the years passed, she wore the mask of magnificence. Her makeup grew heavier, her hair more elaborate, but it was all part of the performance. She was creating an image, one that would outlast her. To her people, the court was a mirror of her rule, majestic, intelligent, and fiercely controlled. And at its centre stood a queen who understood better than anyone that power wasn't just taken, it was performed. Though Elizabeth's court dazzled with poetry and splendour, shadows gathered beyond the palace walls. Her reign was marked not only by brilliance, but by constant threats, some born from ambition, others from blood. Among the most dangerous of these was her own cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary was everything Elizabeth was not: Catholic, widowed young, and a former Queen Consort of France. To many English Catholics, Mary had the stronger claim to the English throne. She was seen not just as an alternative, but as the rightful queen. And worse still, she was living under Elizabeth's watchful eye. After being forced to abdicate her Scottish throne, Mary fled to England in 1568, expecting Elizabeth's protection. What she found instead was elegant imprisonment. She was moved from castle to castle, closely guarded, politely confined. For nearly 19 years, Mary was a guest in a gilded cage. But she was never harmless. Plots formed around her. Letters were smuggled. Conspirators whispered her name in darkened halls. Some wanted to kill Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. Time and again, Elizabeth hesitated. Mary was, after all, royalty, a fellow queen, and Elizabeth believed deeply in the divine right of monarchs. How could she justify executing one of her own? And yet, the plots kept coming. Finally, one went too far. In 1586, the Babington plot was uncovered, a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and free Mary. This time, the evidence was undeniable. Mary's own letters were discovered, proving her involvement. Elizabeth wrestled with the decision. She signed the death warrant, then paused, then signed again. On February 8, 1587, Mary was executed at Fotheringhay Castle. The moment was solemn, grim. Mary wore red, the colour of Catholic martyrdom. When the axe fell, Europe was horrified. Elizabeth herself retreated into days of silence. She claimed the execution was done without her final consent. But the deed was done. The Queen had destroyed her greatest rival. It was a turning point, not just politically, but emotionally. From that moment forward, Elizabeth became more isolated. She trusted fewer people. Her decisions carried more weight. She knew now, in the most painful way, that being queen meant carrying both the crown and the consequences. She had survived rebellion, but it cost her a piece of her soul. The year was 1588, and a storm was coming, not from the skies, but from across the sea. For decades, tension had simmered between Protestant England and Catholic Spain. At last, the conflict erupted into the most iconic military crisis of Elizabeth's reign, the Spanish Armada. Spain, led by King Philip II, had once been Elizabeth's suitor. Now, he was her enemy. Outraged by Mary, Queen of Scots' execution, and angered by English raids on Spanish ships, Philip launched a grand invasion. Over 130 ships, carrying more than 30,000 men, set sail for England. It was called the Invincible Armada. England was outmatched, fewer ships, fewer men, less firepower. But Elizabeth had something Spain didn't: speed, strategy, and unshakable resolve. As the Armada approached, Elizabeth travelled to Tilbury, where English troops awaited. Clad in armour, beneath a silver breastplate, she delivered a speech that would become legend. "I may have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." Her words stirred the soldiers, but the battle would be fought at sea. English ships, smaller and faster, harassed the Spanish formation in the narrow channel. Fireships scattered the fleet at Calais, and then nature intervened. Terrible storms battered the Spanish as they tried to flee north around Scotland and Ireland. Many ships were wrecked. Thousands of men were lost. When it was over, only half of the Armada returned to Spain. The invasion had failed. Elizabeth had survived. But the victory was not just military. It was symbolic. England, small and divided only a generation before, had stood against the most powerful empire in the world and endured. Elizabeth's image as the Virgin Queen became more powerful than ever. She was no longer just a monarch, she was a national icon. Paintings showed her standing tall with her hand over the globe, her gown studded with eyes and ears, symbolizing her awareness, her command. The moment solidified her legacy. The defeat of the Armada didn't end all threats, but it marked a turning point. Elizabeth's England would never be underestimated again. And the Queen, once doubted by kings and dismissed as a woman alone, had now proven herself invincible. In the years that followed the defeat of the Spanish Armada, Queen Elizabeth I stood at the height of her power. Her face adorned medals, coins, and tapestries. Foreign ambassadors bowed with reverence. Her people praised her as Gloriana, the shining jewel of England. But time, like the tide, could not be held back. The Queen, who once dazzled with youth and wit, now entered her 50s and 60s. Her most trusted counsellors began to die. William Cecil, her wise and faithful adviser for 4 decades, passed away. Robert Dudley, perhaps the only man she ever loved, died unexpectedly in 1588. When she heard the news, she locked herself in her chambers and refused to eat for days. The court grew colder. New courtiers sought power, but few earned her trust. She grew more suspicious, more reserved. Her days were filled with ceremony and statecraft, but her nights, increasingly, with silence. One of her last favourites, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, embodied the trouble of this fading era. Young, charming, and ambitious, Essex captured Elizabeth's favour, but also her ire. He disobeyed orders, failed in battle, and eventually led a reckless rebellion against the crown in 1601. Elizabeth was forced to sign his death warrant. He was executed for treason, and with him, another piece of her heart vanished. Economically, the country strained. War had emptied the treasury. The cost of living rose. The once glittering court became more ceremonial, less vibrant. Yet the people still loved her. They saw in Elizabeth not just a queen, but the spirit of their nation, enduring, proud, and unyielding. In her final years, Elizabeth refused to name a successor, fearful that it would undermine her authority while she still lived. She stood alone, increasingly weary, yet unwilling to let go of power. The once glorious pageants grew fewer. The dances slowed. The sparkle dimmed, but the crown remained firmly on her head. She wore white lead makeup to mask the aging face beneath. Her hair, once auburn, was now a wig, but she still stood tall in her towering gowns, her voice commanding even when her strength waned. In her twilight, she clung to one thing above all else, her image, because she knew, long before others did, that her legend would outlive her. By the dawn of 1603, Queen Elizabeth III was a woman at the end of a long and extraordinary journey. She had ruled England for 44 years, guiding it through rebellion, invasion, plague, and Renaissance. But now, at age 69, she was tired. She withdrew more often from public life. Her appetite faded. She grew thinner, more distant, sometimes lost in thought for hours, sitting silently beneath the windows of Richmond Palace. Those closest to her knew the Queen was slipping away. She refused to take to her bed. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was fear of the symbolism. A monarch lying down meant a monarch nearing death. She stood or sat on cushions on the floor for hours, dressed in white, cloaked in silence. When her doctors pressed her to rest, she replied softly, "Must is not a word to be used to princes." In her final days, Elizabeth reportedly pointed to the name of James VI of Scotland as her successor, son of Mary, Queen of Scots. It was a full circle of fate. The woman she had once executed would now have a son inherit her throne. But there was no bitterness in it, only inevitability. On March 24, 1603, the Virgin Queen passed away in her sleep. The news echoed through London. Bells rang, black cloth draped the streets, and her people mourned. Not just the loss of a ruler, but the end of an age. The Tudor dynasty was over. Yet something remarkable happened. Elizabeth's legend did not fade. It grew. She was remembered not as a frail, aging monarch, but as the radiant queen who had stood tall against empires, who gave her name to an era of discovery, drama, and defiance. She became myth. To this day, she remains one of the most admired women in history. The Virgin Queen, the Gloriana, the mother of her people, who ruled alone, and left behind a golden age. She was born in scandal, raised in fear, crowned in doubt, but died a queen of legend. And though her voice has long been silent, the echoes of her reign still shape the soul of a nation. England was her husband, and history, her child. Long before the rise of modern hospitals, long before sterile tools and electric lights, the people of ancient Egypt practiced medicine in the warm golden land along the Nile. Here, beneath a sky of blazing sun and soft starlight, healing was both a sacred act and a daily necessity. The Egyptians believed that good health was a gift from the gods, and illness a sign of divine displeasure or spiritual imbalance. To be sick was not simply to be physically unwell, it was to be out of harmony with the world, the body, or the gods themselves. Health required balance, and so medicine was inseparable from religion, magic, and ritual. Healing began not with a diagnosis, but with a prayer. Temples were the first hospitals. Within their stone columns and perfumed air, priest-physicians listened to the cries of the ill, touched their foreheads, whispered incantations, and prepared herbal remedies with delicate care. The god Thoth, bringer of wisdom, and Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of plague and protection, were often called upon for healing. In many cases, medicine was not just applied, it was invoked. But the Egyptians were also practical. They observed wounds, cleaned them with wine or water from the Nile, and wrapped them with clean linen. They learned which herbs reduced fevers, which oils soothed the skin, and which minerals stopped bleeding. Their knowledge was passed down carefully, written in ink on fragile papyrus scrolls, guarded by temple scribes, and taught only to the trusted. They knew that certain diseases came with patterns, that childbirth required skill and cleanliness, that infection could be deadly, and that healing took both hands and words. To live in ancient Egypt was to live with death always close. Crocodiles in the river, sandstorms in the desert, and disease in every corner. But it was also to live with beauty, rhythm, and care. People bathed daily. They used ointments to soften their skin, chewed herbs to freshen their breath, and honoured their bodies as sacred vessels. Medicine in ancient Egypt was not just about survival. It was about preservation, of health, of life, and eventually of the soul itself. In the land of the Nile, healing was both a science and a prayer whispered to eternity. In the world of ancient Egypt, a healer was never simply a doctor. He was often a priest, a scholar, and a servant of the gods. Medicine was not merely learned, it was revealed through divine connection. And so, the earliest physicians were temple-bound, guided by sacred texts and celestial forces. These physician priests were known as Sunu. They did not wear white coats, but linen robes. They carried not stethoscopes, but scrolls, amulets, and carved ritual tools. They served not only the sick, but the gods who watched over the health of all. One such deity was Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing, and sacred knowledge. He was believed to have gifted medicine to mankind, recording its principles in books locked deep within temple libraries. Thoth's presence was invoked whenever healing began, his name whispered before a word was spoken or a wound touched. But the most feared and revered goddess in this realm was Sekhmet. With the face of a lioness and eyes of fire, Sekhmet represented both disease and its cure. She was said to bring plagues upon Egypt when angered, but also to lift them when appeased. Prayers to Sekhmet were spoken with awe. Her priests memorized hundreds of rituals to calm her wrath and channel her healing strength. When a patient fell ill, the Sunu consulted the gods through ritual. They would anoint sacred statues, burn incense, and chant over water to make it holy. Sometimes, healing began with a dream. Patients slept inside temples, hoping the gods would reveal the cure while they rested in divine silence. Yet alongside the gods stood men like Imhotep, a real physician, architect and sage who lived over 4,000 years ago, and was later worshipped as the god of medicine. Shrines were built in his name, and his wisdom was thought to protect against sickness, even centuries after his death. This was the heart of Egyptian medicine, divine and practical, ancient and eternal. To treat the body, one had to honour the spirit. Healing required not just skill, but reverence. Every remedy was a ritual, every illness a message from the heavens. And the physician-priest stood between two worlds, part healer, part messenger, forever listening to the breath of the gods. Deep within the storerooms of ancient temples, where the air was dry and the scent of incense lingered, scrolls were kept like treasure. Among them was one of the greatest artifacts of healing ever written, the Ebers Papyrus. Discovered in the 19th century but penned over 3,500 years ago, this massive scroll stretched over 65 feet long. Written in careful hieratic script, it contained more than 700 remedies, spells, and surgical techniques. It was not just a medical manual. It was a living reflection of how the Egyptians viewed the body, disease, and the unseen forces that moved between them. The papyrus addressed nearly every part of the human form. There were treatments for eye infections and stomach pain, for broken bones and hair loss, for breathing troubles and even mental disturbances. Some cures were purely herbal: cloves, honey, onions, and resins ground into pastes or steeped in wine. Others required chants or ritual gestures, calling on divine names to activate their power. One passage offered advice on treating asthma: a mixture of herbs heated on stones, with the patient instructed to inhale the rising vapours. Another described the symptoms of diabetes-like conditions, frequent urination and thirst, revealing an understanding of chronic illness far ahead of its time. And yet, mixed among these observations were rituals, instructions to draw protective symbols on the skin, to recite words over amulets, or to bury certain materials beneath the moonlight. The Egyptians did not separate science from the sacred. To them, knowledge came from the gods, and healing required both the hand and the spirit. The Ebers Papyrus also spoke of the mitu, a concept believed to be channels or vessels that carried air, blood, and other life forces throughout the body. Though not fully aligned with modern anatomy, it hinted at a deep curiosity about internal systems. The Egyptians may not have had microscopes, but they observed, they recorded, and they remembered. This ancient scroll was likely studied in temple schools, passed between physician priests, and consulted in times of illness or divine uncertainty. To touch its linen surface was to hold 1,000 years of accumulated wisdom, and within its fragile folds, the heartbeat of ancient Egyptian medicine still gently echoes. Though steeped in divine ritual and sacred chants, ancient Egyptian medicine was also remarkably hands-on. When wounds opened or bones snapped, when infection spread or childbirth grew perilous, there were no prayers that could replace the steady hand of a healer. Egyptian physicians understood the urgency of the body in crisis. They treated injuries with surprising precision, guided not only by the gods but by experience, observation, and ingenuity. Their tools, made of bronze or obsidian, were simple but effective: knives, hooks, clamps, and needles, often cleaned with wine or fire to purify them before use. When a patient suffered a cut or gash, the physician would cleanse it with honey, a natural antiseptic, rich in enzymes that killed bacteria. Then came linen bandages, carefully wrapped to protect the wound and promote healing. These were not the coarse strips used for mummies, but soft, bleached cloth, sometimes infused with herbs or oils to soothe the skin. For broken bones, splints were carved from wood or reeds and tied securely with strips of fabric. Dislocated joints were massaged back into place with oils. Swelling was reduced using cool compresses made from crushed lotus root or ground minerals. Even burns were treated, with mixtures of milk, honey, and clay to draw out heat and prevent infection. Surgeons understood the body's structure through animal dissection and battlefield necessity. Though internal surgery was rare, abscesses could be drained, boils lanced, and infected tissue removed. They even practiced a form of cauterization, using heat to stop bleeding or close wounds, sometimes with incantations spoken alongside, as if to seal the injury on both physical and spiritual levels. There was no anesthesia in the modern sense, but sedatives existed. Mandrake root, poppy extract, and fermented drinks could dull pain and ease the body into a dreamlike stillness. And through all of it, there was a sense of calm. The healer worked slowly, methodically. Each motion had meaning. Each patient was a soul in need of restoration, not just a body to be mended. In these moments, amid blood and bandages, the sacred met the practical. And through steady hands and ancient herbs, Egypt's sunlit temples gave birth to some of the world's first true surgeons. To walk into an ancient Egyptian healing chamber was to enter a space where the seen and the unseen coexisted. While herbs and salves were prepared by hand, just as vital were the words spoken, spells, incantations, and sacred names whispered into the air like medicine for the spirit. Illness was not always blamed on natural causes. Often it was believed that evil spirits, malevolent gods, or the restless dead had invaded the body. Cures had to be physical and spiritual. That meant using magic, not as superstition, but as a legitimate branch of medicine. A healer might begin by chanting over the patient, invoking protective deities like Isis, the nurturing mother goddess, or Bez, the dwarf god who warded off nightmares and disease. The rhythm of the chant was important. It had to flow like the Nile, smooth and uninterrupted. These incantations were thought to cleanse the air around the patient, drawing out invisible forces that caused pain or imbalance. In addition to words, amulets were essential tools of protection. Worn around the neck, tied to the wrist, or hidden beneath wrappings, these charms were shaped with sacred intention. A scarab symbolized renewal and rebirth. The Eye of Horus protected against harm and ensured healing. An ankh, the looped cross, offered vitality and long life. Each amulet was often made of specific materials, gold, lapis lazuli, carnelian, believed to hold magical vibrations. They were blessed in temple rituals before being given to the sick. Some cures called for complex magical procedures. A spell might require the writing of a sacred name on a piece of papyrus, which would then be burned, buried, or swallowed with water. Other rituals involved drawing protective circles on the floor or painting symbols on the patient's skin to block evil forces from returning. Even medicines themselves were sometimes accompanied by spells. A poultice for a snakebite might be applied with the spoken words, "Come out, poison. May Ra strike your heart." This union of word and substance, of spirit and science, formed the true heart of Egyptian healing. For them, the body could not be healed unless the soul was soothed. And so the healer became both doctor and sorcerer, treating the wounds that could be seen and casting out the ones that could not. Beneath the shadows of temple walls and along the fertile banks of the Nile, the ancient Egyptians gathered their medicine not from bottles, but from the earth. Leaves, roots, resins, seeds and flowers. Nature was their apothecary, and the land itself was filled with healing. The Egyptians knew their plants well. They understood which herbs cooled fevers, which eased pain, and which stirred the stomach into calm. Their remedies were not guessed. They were learned, passed from healer to apprentice, etched into papyri, and refined over generations. To soothe burns, they used aloe vera, its thick gel applied directly to damaged skin. For infections, they turned to myrrh, a fragrant resin harvested from desert trees. Myrrh was antibacterial, soothing, and sacred, burned in temples, rubbed into wounds, and mixed with wine for sore throats. Pain was relieved using willow bark, which contained salicin, an early version of aspirin. The bark was chewed or brewed into tea, its bitter taste masking the power within. Coriander, cumin, garlic, and juniper berries were used for digestion, while fenugreek calmed coughs and licorice root sweetened the breath and soothed the throat. Many remedies were prepared with care. Ingredients were ground on smooth stone pallets, mixed with oil, wine, milk, or honey, and administered in carefully measured doses. Some were swallowed, others applied to the skin. Some were packed into wounds, others were burned so the patient could inhale their healing smoke. Honey was a common ingredient, not just for taste, but for its natural ability to fight infection and preserve tissue. Milk and beer, sacred in daily life, became carriers for powdered herbs or crushed minerals. Even animals played a role. Fat from crocodiles or hippos, crushed beetles or snakeskin might be used in rare treatments, though always balanced by ritual and prayer. Every ingredient had purpose, both physical and symbolic. Their medicine cabinets were not hidden behind glass. They grew from gardens, markets, and temple courtyards. The world itself was filled with healing, if one knew where to look. And though their pharmacology was born from intuition rather than chemistry, the results spoke for themselves. For in ancient Egypt, plants were more than tools. They were silent physicians, rooted in the rhythms of life. To the ancient Egyptian healer, diagnosing an illness was not a quick or simple task. The body, after all, was a vessel not only of blood and bone, but of spirit, emotion, and destiny. Understanding what ailed a person meant observing not just symptoms, but signs. Not just the flesh, but the fate behind it. The physician-priest would begin by listening to the voice of the patient, the rhythm of their breath, the expression in their eyes. He might feel the pulse, not as we do today, counting beats, but sensing patterns of energy, tension, or imbalance in the flow of life through the body's hidden channels. They examined urine, sweat, and stools, looking for colour, odour, or unusual texture. The tongue might be inspected, as well as the skin, pale or flushed, hot or clammy, dry or slick with oil. But beyond these physical clues, a deeper question was always asked. Why now? Illness, to them, had cause, but it also had context. Was this punishment from a god? A curse from a jealous rival? An unseen spirit clinging to the soul? In more mysterious cases, healers turned to divination. They might consult the Book of Dreams, interpreting visions the patient had while sleeping. A dream of falling could mean a loss of protection. A dream of drowning might suggest the soul was overwhelmed. Temples even offered dream incubation chambers, where the ill slept overnight hoping to receive guidance from the gods themselves. Some healers drew sacred symbols in the sand, or cast small bones to read patterns. Others watched birds or consulted oracles, asking for signs from the divine. A diagnosis could come from the stars, from the flight of a hawk, or from the quiet hiss of wind through papyrus reeds. For those suffering mental distress, visions, confusion, or deep sorrow, the diagnosis might be spiritual possession. The cure? A blend of herbs, soothing words, and powerful incantations to banish the intruder from the mind. In Egypt, to diagnose was not only to name a disease, but to understand its story. Every illness had a beginning, a message, and, if the gods willed it, a cure. And the healer's role was to uncover that hidden thread and gently bring it back into balance. To the ancient Egyptians, death was not the end. It was a continuation, a doorway, a sacred transition from one world to the next. And just as a physician healed the living, he also prepared the dead. The art of mummification was, in truth, a final act of medicine. The process was long, 70 days of careful ritual preparation. It began with the washing of the body, using water from the Nile and fragrant palm wine to purify the flesh. Then came the removal of the internal organs, the stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver, each carefully taken and placed into canopic jars, watched over by protective gods. The heart, believed to house the soul and memory, was often left inside the body. In some cases, it was replaced by a sacred amulet, a scarab, to ensure safe passage through the afterlife. The most delicate step was the removal of the brain. A long, hooked tool was inserted through the nose, breaking the thin bone behind the eyes. The brain was drawn out in fragments, not considered vital for the afterlife. Once emptied, the body was packed with natron salt, a powerful drying agent. For 40 days, it rested in stillness as moisture left the flesh. Then came the wrapping, a process both medicinal and mystical. Hundreds of yards of linen were layered around the limbs, fingers, and torso, often inscribed with protective spells and sealed with resin. Amulets were placed between the layers, each symbol meant to guard a part of the spirit's journey. The Eye of Horus for protection, the Ankh for eternal life, the Jed pillar for strength and stability. The final wrapping was often done with great ceremony. Priests recited the opening of the mouth ritual, symbolically restoring the senses so the soul could eat, speak, and breathe in the afterlife. Perfumed oils were applied. A mask, often golden, was placed upon the face. The mummified body was then placed in a carved sarcophagus. And finally, within a tomb filled with food, tools, and texts for the next world. For the Egyptians, to preserve the body was not vanity. It was love. It was the final healing, the eternal medicine. And through it, death itself was softened into sleep. Though the sands have long covered the temples, and the papyrus scrolls have faded with time, the wisdom of Egypt's ancient healers still echoes in quiet ways. Their blend of science and spirit, of herbs and hymns, laid the foundation for generations to come, not only in medicine, but in how we understand the human experience of healing. Many of their practices travelled far. Greek scholars, including Hippocrates and Galen, studied Egyptian texts and techniques. The Greeks built upon Egyptian ideas of anatomy, diagnosis, and herbal remedies. Even the word pharmacy traces its roots to the Egyptian Per Ankh, the house of life, where medicine, magic, and writing were preserved. Concepts like hygiene, wound care, and the importance of observation all find echoes in modern clinics. The ancient use of honey as an antiseptic, willow bark for pain, and garlic to strengthen the body are still supported by today's science. In some ways, the Nile's physicians were not primitive. They were pioneers, walking the line between the tangible and the divine. Yet their greatest legacy may not be found in ingredients or instruments, but in philosophy. They treated not just the body, but the soul. They listened not just to words, but to dreams. They understood that healing requires more than touch. It requires presence, stillness, intention. To them, illness was a message, a story to be unravelled, a sign of imbalance between the earth, the heavens, and the human heart. And healing was not just a cure, it was a return to harmony. In a world now ruled by machines and measurements, something of their ancient reverence still speaks. The quiet patience of the physician-priest, the soft chant over a cup of herbs, the belief that the act of healing in itself is sacred. Today, we walk in the shadow of those sunlit halls, where stone lions once stood guard, and incense drifted through columns, and in the quiet corners of modern medicine, where a hand is held, a prayer is whispered, or a life is honoured, we still feel the heartbeat of those who came before. The healers of the Nile have not been forgotten. They are still with us, in every breath that seeks to heal, and every soul that longs for peace. Ding. In the spring of 1945, Berlin was no longer the heart of an empire. It was a city in ruins. Bombed from the sky, battered by tanks and hollowed by years of war, the once proud capital of Nazi Germany was now a silent landscape of crumbling stone and broken windows. Streets were unrecognizable, landmarks reduced to rubble. The war had ended, but what followed was not peace. The victorious Allied powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union and France, met to decide the fate of Germany. Though enemies of the Nazis, they were not truly allies. Their ideologies had always stood in contrast. And now, as they stared across the same table, that contrast began to harden. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones, each governed by one of the Allies. Berlin, despite lying entirely within the Soviet zone, was also divided. A city within a country, split among 4 foreign powers. What began as cooperation, an attempt to stabilize the nation, quickly shifted. Ideals clashed, agreements frayed. In the Western zones, the Americans, British and French encouraged democratic rebuilding. They introduced free elections, supported private enterprise, and sought to revive Germany's economy. In the Eastern Zone, the Soviets imposed centralized control. They dismantled industry, censored opposition, and established the roots of a socialist state aligned with Moscow. Berlin became the epicenter of this growing rift. Once a single metropolis, it now hosted 2 opposing futures. West Berlin began to fill with American goods, jazz music, and newspapers. East Berlin echoed with propaganda, food rationing, and political purges. In these early post-war years, the border between East and West was not yet walled. People could still move freely between sectors, passing from one world to another by crossing a street. But tensions rose with each passing month. In 1948, when the Western Allies introduced a new currency, the Soviets retaliated with the Berlin blockade, sealing off road and rail access to the city. In response, the West launched the Berlin Airlift, a massive operation flying in food, fuel, and supplies. For nearly a year, West Berlin survived on wings. By the time the blockade ended, one thing was clear. Berlin was no longer just a city. It was a symbol, a fault line between freedom and control, between East and West, and it would only grow deeper. The end of the war had brought victory, but not unity. As months turned into years, the uneasy partnership between the Allies deteriorated into quiet hostility. The world was dividing, not just ideologically, but physically. And nowhere was that split more visible than in Berlin. The city that once stood as the cultural and political heart of Germany was now a microcosm of the entire Cold War. On one side, the Western Allies, led by the United States, pushed for reconstruction, democracy, and open markets. On the other, the Soviet Union moved swiftly to transform its sector into a socialist stronghold, aligning Berlin's east with Moscow's vision of the world. At first, the lines weren't drawn in concrete, but in policy. West Berlin flourished with American investment and consumer culture. Supermarkets, cars, and cinemas signaled a return to normalcy. East Berlin, however, became a city of ration cards, grey buildings, and propaganda posters promising equality through obedience. And the people noticed. Between 1949 and 1961, over 2.5 million East Germans fled to the West, many through Berlin. Teachers, engineers, doctors, and young professionals walked across the border, seeking opportunity and freedom. It was an exodus the East could not afford to sustain. As the escape numbers climbed, tensions reached a boiling point. The East German government, backed by the Soviets, accused the West of deliberately luring its citizens away. The West countered that people were simply choosing liberty. Each side pointed fingers. Each side fortified their stance. In the East, the Stasi, the secret police, grew in size and power, tasked with suppressing dissent and monitoring loyalty. In the West, American troops remained stationed as both symbol and shield. Every bus that crossed sectors, every conversation overheard in a cafe, every glance at a foreign newspaper carried the weight of ideology. Berlin was no longer just divided. It was tense, fragile, and bracing for something more permanent. A wall didn't exist yet, but the idea of it had already taken root. The Iron Curtain was closing, brick by silent brick, and Berlin stood directly in its shadow. Soon that shadow would take form, and what had been imagined would become real. It happened without warning. In the still hours of the night on August 13, 1961, East Berliners awoke to find their world changed. Soldiers, construction crews, and police moved silently under the cover of darkness, unrolling barbed wire and digging trenches. Roads were blocked, train lines were cut, Families were divided in an instant. What had been an invisible border between East and West Berlin now had form. It wasn't a wall, not yet. It began as fencing, makeshift barricades, and rows of armed guards. But even in its earliest hours, it was unmistakably a prison. The East German government called it a protective barrier. They claimed it was necessary to defend socialism from Western aggression. In truth, it was built to stop the flow of people, to trap them within a regime that was hemorrhaging its citizens. Chaos followed. People raced to windows overlooking West Berlin, shouting to relatives they could no longer reach. Some tried to escape immediately, leaping from apartment buildings that bordered the dividing line, jumping into nets held by West Berlin firefighters. Others were pulled back by East German guards. A few were shot. Some fell to their deaths. Within days, concrete began replacing wire. Taller, stronger walls were poured and hardened. Streets that once flowed freely were now sealed by slabs of stone and guarded towers. Checkpoint Charlie, one of the few sanctioned crossings, became a tense standoff point, where American and Soviet tanks would one day face each other, muzzle to muzzle. The wall grew quickly, 96 miles of separation, encircling West Berlin like a noose. Watchtowers, searchlights, tripwires, and anti-vehicle trenches turned the border into a militarized zone. Anyone caught attempting to cross could be arrested, shot, or disappear entirely. It was more than a structure. It was a message. The message that freedom would now come at a cost. That movement, choice, and reunion were no longer rights, but risks. For the people of Berlin, the wall was not just a border. It was a wound, raw, sudden, and unhealed. And though built overnight, its shadow would stretch across decades. After August 1961, Berlin was no longer one city. It was two lives, unfolding side by side, divided not only by concrete, but by ideology, fear, and silence. In West Berlin, surrounded entirely by East German territory, life moved forward, free but encircled. The city became a showcase of Western democracy. Streets buzzed with cafes, bookstores, and universities. Western radio and television broadcast news, music, and culture. American troops patrolled visibly, a quiet guarantee of protection. Yet despite its freedom, West Berlin remained an island, cut off, isolated, always aware of the wall just blocks away. For those living in East Berlin, life was more carefully controlled. The government promised safety, equality, and jobs for all. But behind that promise stood a powerful instrument of surveillance, the Stasi, East Germany's secret police. They listened, watched, and recorded. Nearly 1 in 6 East Germans became informants, sometimes willingly, often under pressure. Neighbours spied on neighbours. Teachers monitored students. Friends vanished after private conversations. A wrong word could mean arrest. A joke could end a career. And still, most people endured. They worked, raised families, went to concerts and museums, but always with a sense that someone was listening, that their lives were not entirely their own. The wall became part of the landscape. Children grew up playing in its shadow, never having known a time before it. Lovers stood on opposite sides, waving silently across the divide. Grandparents died without seeing their grandchildren again. Even telephone lines between East and West were severed. Letters were censored. Emotions had to be folded up, like maps of a city you could no longer reach. And yet, people adapted. West Berliners held protests and candlelight vigils. East Berliners found quiet joy where they could, through music, poetry, whispered dreams. Churches became places of refuge, where resistance could be spoken behind stained glass and candles. But no one ever forgot the wall. It was always there, grey, cold, and watching. A constant reminder that freedom could be taken in a night. And for the people of Berlin, life became a balancing act, of hope and resignation, of love and loss, of waiting and remembering. Waiting for the day the wall might fall. The Berlin Wall stood as a fortress, concrete, steel, and silence. But even the strongest walls could not stop the human desire for freedom. And so, from the moment it rose, people began searching for ways to go over, under, and through. Some tried within hours. In those first confused days, people leapt from windows of buildings that bordered the west. Some made it. Others fell to their deaths as East German authorities rushed to brick up the exits. Over time, the escapes became more desperate and more daring. One group of friends spent months digging a tunnel beneath the wall, hauling dirt out in buckets and working by candlelight. In the end, 29 people crawled to freedom through that narrow passage. Another family floated across the border in a homemade hot air balloon, stitched together from scraps of nylon and powered by propane tanks. Others hid in modified cars, curled beneath floorboards or crammed into secret compartments behind dashboards. A young man once drove full speed into a checkpoint with his windshield removed, so the border guards couldn't see him duck moments before he crossed. The gamble worked. He lived. Some tried to swim, the icy waters of canals and rivers offering a dangerous but open route. A few succeeded. Many did not. Bullets were often faster than water. In total, more than 5,000 people successfully escaped from East Berlin during the wall years. But over 140 lost their lives in the attempt. Each one became a symbol of courage, desperation, and the cost of control. Among the most haunting was Peter Fechter, an 18-year-old shot while trying to climb over the wall in 1962. He fell back into the death strip, crying out for help as soldiers stood watching. No one came. He bled to death in view of the world. His story, and so many others, echoed beyond Berlin, stirring outrage and sorrow across the globe. For those who escaped, life in the West was often bittersweet. Freedom came with guilt, grief, and the knowledge that loved ones remained behind. But each successful crossing struck a quiet blow against the wall's power, because every escape was more than a journey. It was a reminder that no wall, no matter how high or guarded, could stop the will to be free. Not everyone could escape. For many in East Berlin, crossing the wall was never an option. Family, risk, or circumstance held them in place. But staying didn't mean surrendering. In the quiet corners of everyday life, resistance took root, not with weapons, but with words, whispers, and willpower. Writers and poets smuggled their work westward, publishing banned manuscripts under pen names. Their voices, too dangerous to speak aloud in the East, were carried over the airwaves by Western radio. Even the act of listening became an act of rebellion, tuning into radio-free Europe, volume turned low, curtains drawn shut. Churches became sanctuaries, not just of worship, but of truth. While the state watched schools and workplaces, the Lutheran Church offered space for discussion, dissent, and hope. In candlelit halls, people gathered to talk about peace, reform, and the possibility of change. The regime tolerated the church only reluctantly, and its leaders became guardians of the last slivers of free thought. Artists turned blank walls into symbols. Painters created surreal, dreamlike pieces laced with meaning. Musicians recorded underground cassettes filled with lyrics that criticized the regime in metaphor. Even graffiti, dangerous and illegal, became a voice in the dark. Students passed notes in code. Families told jokes behind closed doors. Children grew up learning to speak in two ways, one for school, one for home. The Stasi watched it all. Their network was vast. Informants in universities, apartment buildings, theatres. A careless comment could result in interrogation or worse. Yet still, people resisted. Not loudly, not always visibly, but persistently. In West Berlin, solidarity movements rallied and amplified those voices. Activists sent books, letters, and support across the divide. Western musicians held concerts at the wall, their music spilling over the concrete. David Bowie, in 1987, sang Heroes, just meters from East Berlin, his voice heard by thousands on both sides. Some resistance was dramatic, others quiet and slow burning. But each act, no matter how small, was a refusal to forget that freedom existed just beyond reach. The wall could divide a city, but it could not fully crush the human spirit. In silence, in song, in secret smiles, resistance endured. And beneath the surface of control, something was shifting. By the mid-1980s, change was stirring, not just in Berlin, but across the Eastern Bloc. The Soviet Union, long the architect of East Germany's policies, was beginning to shift. Under Mikhail Gorbachev, reforms known as glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, began to ripple through the rigid steel of communist control. But East Germany's leadership resisted. Hardline and paranoid, they rejected reform, insisting that socialism would continue untouched. Yet the people knew otherwise. The outside world was no longer out of reach. Western television beamed images of prosperity. Radio waves carried voices of change. Travellers returned with stories of life beyond the wall. Then something unexpected happened. In Hungary, a fellow Eastern Bloc nation, border fences began to come down. In May 1989, Hungary opened its border with Austria, creating a quiet escape route to the west. Thousands of East Germans poured into Hungary, then crossed into Austria and freedom. This wave of defiance sparked a chain reaction. Peaceful protests spread through East Germany. In Leipzig, citizens gathered in churches and public squares, holding candles and chanting "Wir sind das Volk," "We are the people." Their message was clear. The government no longer spoke for them. Week after week, the protests grew. In Dresden, Berlin, and other cities, tens of thousands marched, peacefully but with conviction. For a state built on surveillance and silence, the noise of the people became deafening. International pressure mounted. Cameras captured the marches, the tension, the courage. Even East German security forces began to hesitate. The world was watching, and bloodshed would not go unnoticed. Behind closed doors, East German officials scrambled to respond. In their desperation to calm the protests, they made a mistake. A single sentence at a press conference, delivered without clarity, suggesting that travel restrictions would be eased, effective immediately. The meaning was misunderstood. The people heard one thing: the border is open. That single crack, spoken in confusion, was enough. Crowds began to form at the checkpoints demanding passage. The guards, stunned and uncertain, reached for phones that no one answered. And on that fragile, quiet confusion, a wall that had stood for 28 years began to tremble. It was the night of November 9th, 1989, cool, quiet, and unremarkable at first. But by evening, something extraordinary began to unfold. Following the now infamous press conference blunder, where an East German official stated that citizens could cross the border immediately, thousands of East Berliners gathered at the wall. Confused, excited, skeptical, they came with passports, questions, and hope. At checkpoint Bornholmer Strasse, the guards were overwhelmed. They hadn't received orders. No one knew what to do. Crowds grew. The chants became louder. "Open the gate!" Some guards shouted into phones, asking for instructions, asking for help. But the higher-ups too were caught off guard. No orders came. And then, at 10:45 p.m., a miracle born of hesitation happened. A single border guard, faced with thousands of unrelenting citizens and no clear direction, made a choice. He opened the gate. Within moments, people surged forward, laughing, crying, embracing strangers. East Berliners poured into the west, where crowds were already waiting with champagne, flowers, and tears. The divide of decades was now a flood of joy. As midnight approached, Berliners climbed the wall itself. They stood atop the concrete monster that had haunted them for 28 years, arms raised to the sky. Some chipped away at it with hammers and chisels, turning the wall into dust and souvenirs. Others simply sat in silence, unable to speak through the emotion. There was no violence, no sirens, no bullets, only freedom. The world watched in awe. News anchors struggled to hold back tears. Politicians scrambled to understand what was happening. But for the people of Berlin, there was nothing to debate. The wall had fallen, not by decree, not by policy, but by the will of those who refused to live divided. That night, the city sang. Streets once patrolled by soldiers rang with music, clinking glasses, and the murmur of reunions. Siblings met after decades. Old lovers embraced. Strangers kissed through wire fences now pulled apart. The wall had tried to silence them. But on that night, it became the loudest silence in history, broken not by bombs, but by joy. And in those early morning hours, Berlin was whole again, not yet officially, but undeniably. The wall had fallen. But the path to healing was just beginning. In the weeks that followed November 9th, 1989, Berlin transformed. Borders stayed open. Guard towers were abandoned. Bulldozers moved in. Pieces of the wall were chiselled away, kept as souvenirs, sold in markets, sent around the world. Each fragment, a symbol of something bigger, a victory of unity over division. On October 3rd, 1990, less than a year later, East and West Germany were officially reunified. The flags changed. The maps were redrawn. Berlin was no longer an island, no longer a front line. It was once again the capital of a single sovereign nation. But reunification was not instant harmony. East and West had grown apart, not just in wealth and infrastructure, but in memory. East Germans, or Ossis, had lived under surveillance and restriction. West Germans, or Wessis, had lived in freedom, but often misunderstood what life behind the wall had cost. The physical barrier had been removed, but emotional ones took longer. Still, Berlin moved forward. The Brandenburg Gate, once trapped in the death strip between two worlds, became a symbol of celebration. Unity Day became a national holiday. Streets were renamed. Statues came down. And still standing pieces of the wall were left as memorials, not to glorify the past, but to remember it. Today, Berlin is a city reborn. Its walls are now covered in art. Its once divided train lines now run uninterrupted. Where soldiers once stood with rifles, children now play, and where silence once lingered, music flows. But the memory endures. Museums and markers remind visitors where the wall once stood. Small brass plaques on sidewalks name those who died trying to cross. And every year, Berliners light candles on the anniversary of the wall's fall, not in celebration alone, but in reflection. Because the story of the Berlin Wall is not just about division, it's about resilience, about the quiet courage of those who stayed, the daring of those who fled, the voices that refused to be silenced. And in a world that still builds walls, Berlin remains a whisper, a reminder that even the tallest structures can crumble when people choose to stand together. The wall is gone, but the lessons remain. Wall. Before the violin took its shape, the world was already filled with stringed voices, soft, trembling notes that danced through temples, courts, and villages. The idea of drawing sound from string was ancient, older than memory itself. And for centuries, humanity experimented with ways to make wood, gut, and bow create something that resembled song. The earliest known bowed instruments came not from Europe, but from Central Asia and the Middle East. The rebab, with its round belly and haunting tone, spread through Islamic culture and into North Africa and Spain. In Byzantine lands, the lyra echoed in palaces and town squares. In medieval Europe, the fiddle and the viol took root. Flat-backed, fretted instruments often played in ensembles or to accompany dance. These early instruments shared a spirit, if not a shape. They used a bow to stroke the strings, creating sustained tones that mimicked the human voice. But they lacked something, a certain clarity, projection, and flexibility. The music of the Renaissance was growing richer. more expressive. Composers longed for instruments that could match their expanding vision. And so, the search for a more refined sound began. By the 15th and early 16th centuries, a new design began to emerge. It wasn't the product of one man or one moment, but a gradual evolution, shaped by trial, error, and intuition. Luthiers, string instrument makers, experimented with curved tops, arched backs, and F-shaped sound holes, searching for balance between resonance and control. The idea of 4 strings, tuned in fifths, took hold. A smaller body, easier to handle and more agile in voice, became preferred. And most importantly, the instrument was designed not to sit on the lap or be cradled like a viol, but to rest on the shoulder, held close, like a companion. This was not just a technical change, it was emotional. It made the player part of the instrument, and the instrument part of the player. And though it had no official name at first, this new form, this slender, curved, expressive creature, was the birth of what we would come to call the violin. Delicate, powerful, and timeless. In the heart of northern Italy, nestled beside the slow-moving waters of the Po River, lies the quiet city of Cremona. In the 16th century, this was not a city of armies or kings. It was a city of artisans. The streets echoed not with cannons, but with chisels tapping wood, with hands smoothing varnish, with music drifting softly from behind shutters. It was here, in Cremona's workshops, that the violin found its true home. No one can say exactly why Cremona became the cradle of violin making. Perhaps it was the humidity in the air, ideal for curing tonewood. Perhaps it was the abundance of alpine spruce and Balkan maple, the perfect marriage of softness and strength. Or perhaps it was the people, humble craftsmen with careful hands and keen ears, who gave the violin its soul. Among them was Andrea Amati, born around 1505, a luthier whose vision would shape music for centuries. In his small workshop, Amati began to refine the form of this young instrument. He carved its body with elegant symmetry, gave it 4 strings tuned in perfect fifths, and added F-shaped sound holes that allowed the wood to breathe and sing. He didn't invent the violin out of nothing, but he gave it consistency, beauty, and balance. His instruments were commissioned by nobility, including the French court. The violin, once a curiosity, was now a work of art, adorned with delicate decorations and royal crests, capable of both courtly grace and peasant joy. The city itself became a musical forge. Amati's sons and grandsons carried on the tradition, refining his designs and teaching others. New names emerged, Guarneri, Stradivari, each adding their voice to the evolving language of sound. Cremona's violin makers didn't work from plans. There were no blueprints, no machines. Each instrument was born from the eye, the ear, and the hand, measured by feel, shaped by instinct, finished with care. The sound was tested not with tools, but by playing. And so, in the shaded rooms of this quiet Italian town, the violin was born. Not just as an instrument, but as a vessel of emotion, destined to sing in cathedrals, concert halls, and hearts across the world. As the 17th century unfolded, the violin had become more than a novel invention. It was now a voice waiting to be perfected. And in the quiet streets of Cremona, that perfection took shape. Not in marble or paint, but in wood. Enter Antonio Stradivari, born around 1644. A student, perhaps, of Niccolo Amati, he would become the most celebrated luthier in history. In his workshop on Corso Garibaldi, Stradivari carved violins that seemed touched by something divine. The curves, the arching, the varnish, all exact, all elegant. His instruments didn't just resonate, they spoke. Each violin bore the Latin label Antonius Stradivarius Cremonensis, and soon musicians across Europe began to seek them out. His violins projected power in large halls, but still retained warmth and intimacy. Even today, centuries later, no modern instrument has fully surpassed them. But Stradivari was not alone. Down another lane in Cremona, another genius worked, Giuseppe Guarneri del Gesù. A member of the Guarneri family, Giuseppe crafted violins that were darker, fiercer, more untamed. Where Stradivari's voice was golden, Guarneri's was raw and bold, favoured by players who wanted passion over polish. Each violin bore unique traits, subtle asymmetries, signature scrolls, mysterious varnishes, and yet all shared one thing: a soul. These weren't factory-made instruments. They were sculpted individually, with human breath and human error, and somehow that made them more alive. The world began to notice. The violin moved from courtly circles into the spotlight. Performers demanded instruments that could sing, weep, dazzle, and only Cremona's finest would do. Centuries later, these masterpieces would be treasured beyond imagination. A single Stradivarius could sell for millions. Museums displayed them under glass. Historians analysed their wood with microscopes, trying to unlock their secret. But in the end, their magic couldn't be measured. It was not just in the varnish or the grain. It was in the hands that made them, and in the hands that would one day play them. The violins of Stradivari and Guarneri were not instruments. They were voices, preserved in maple and spruce, meant to outlive their makers, to whisper beauty long after silence. In its earliest days, the violin was a guest in the great halls of nobility. It played softly in the background, dancing alongside lutes and harpsichords, offering sweetness to royal feasts and courtly gatherings. But in time, the violin would leave its modest seat and step boldly into the spotlight, not as accompaniment, but as a voice of its own. As Europe entered the Baroque period, music began to shift. Composers no longer wrote only for kings. They wrote for feeling, for grandeur, for drama. The violin, agile and expressive, was perfectly suited for this transformation. It could soar like a bird, whisper like a secret, or cry like a human soul. One of the first to realize its power was Arcangelo Corelli. In Rome, he composed violin sonatas and concerti grossi that showed the instrument's elegance and versatility. His music was lyrical, graceful, and precise. The violin no longer just followed the melody. It was the melody. Then came Antonio Vivaldi, a priest and virtuoso in Venice. He wrote hundreds of violin concertos, each one a vivid painting in sound. His most famous, The Four Seasons, transformed weather into music: spring's blossoms, summer's storms, autumn's harvest, winter's chill, all portrayed through a violin's strings. The instrument was now a storyteller, capable of portraying the world's rhythms. By the late 1600s and early 1700s, the violin had become the jewel of the orchestra. Concert halls replaced courtrooms. Public performances welcomed common citizens, not just royalty. And on these new stages, the violin led the way, commanding attention, demanding emotion. Its shape had not changed much. The instrument itself was still slender and delicate, but its presence had grown. It was no longer a quiet companion. It was a voice for composers, a challenge for performers, and a bridge between the private and the public. The violin had stepped out of the salon and onto the world's stage, and with each performance, each concerto, and each trembling note, it proved that it was not just another instrument. It was the heart of the music. By the 19th century, the violin was no longer confined to elegance. It had become a force of raw expression, capable of thrilling crowds and revealing the most intimate corners of the human soul. And leading this transformation was a man who seemed to be born of myth, Niccolò Paganini. Tall, pale, with long black hair and eyes that burned, Paganini was both genius and enigma. When he played, his fingers blurred across the fingerboard. He leapt across octaves, bent notes into cries, and coaxed sounds from the violin no one thought possible. Rumours swirled. Some said he had sold his soul to the devil in exchange for his gifts. In truth, Paganini had simply mastered the violin in a way no one had before. He invented techniques that pushed the instrument to its limits. Left-hand pizzicato, double stops, rapid harmonics. His compositions weren't just difficult, they were daring, theatrical, emotional. Audiences were mesmerized, composers were inspired, and the violin was now seen not only as a beautiful instrument, but as a mirror of human passion. Others followed. Joseph Joachim, the poetic interpreter of Brahms. Pablo de Sarasate, whose elegance matched Paganini's fire. Fritz Kreisler, who infused charm and warmth into every phrase. Each left their fingerprint not only on the violin's music, but on the violin itself. Composers responded to this new era of virtuosity. They wrote violin concertos that demanded more than just skill. They demanded soul. Mendelssohn's concerto sparkled like moonlight. Tchaikovsky's burned with heartbreak. Brahms thundered with intensity. The violin was asked to feel everything, and it did. No longer limited to chords or accompaniment, the violin had become a soloist, a storyteller. It could now sing of joy and sorrow, fury and longing. In a single note, it could say what words could not. And for the listener, the experience was personal. The violin didn't just play music, it reached inside and stirred something ancient, something aching and beautiful. It was no longer just about performance. The violin had become the voice of the soul. To play the violin is an art, but to make one is something even more elusive. The violin is not assembled, it is sculpted, coaxed from wood with patience, instinct, and centuries of inherited knowledge. No factory or machine can replicate the hands of a master luthier. The process begins with wood, not just any wood, but carefully chosen pieces with the right grain, age, and resonance. Spruce for the top, light and vibrant. Maple for the back and sides, strong and flexible. The wood must be seasoned, sometimes for decades, to reach its perfect voice. Then comes the carving. The arch of the body must be just so. The thickness of the plates, the exact shape of the F-holes, the curve of the scroll, all impact the sound. Luthiers work slowly, listening as they shave away slivers. The goal is not perfection, but balance, between strength and vibration, brilliance and warmth. And then there is the varnish, a mystery that has puzzled scientists for centuries. The golden glow of a Stradivarius, the dark fire of a Guarneri. Each was finished with secret blends of oils, resins, and pigments. Was the magic in the ingredients, or in the hands that applied them? Modern researchers have X-rayed, CT scanned, and chemically analysed the great violins of the past. They've measured frequencies, modelled acoustics, even recreated 3D printed copies. And yet, no one has fully unlocked the secret. Because the secret may not be in the material, but in the relationship. A great violin is more than its parts. It is the product of hours spent listening, adjusting, feeling. The luthier taps the wood, bends the grain, senses its potential. There is no manual for this, only experience, passed quietly from one generation to the next. Even today, in small workshops around the world, violins are still made this way, by hand, by heart. Each one is slightly different, because each piece of wood has its own story, and once the instrument is finished, it waits, silent, breathless, until the bow draws across its strings and brings it to life. The violin does not just sing, it remembers how it was made. Though born in the hands of Italian luthiers, the violin did not stay in Europe. Its voice, so human, so adaptable, was destined to travel. Across mountains and oceans, through trade routes and migration, the violin became a citizen of the world. In Ireland and Scotland, it became the fiddle, lively, earthy, and quick. It led dancers in pubs and village squares, spinning reels and jigs with infectious joy. There the violin wasn't formal, it was familiar. Passed from hand to hand, often learned by ear, it became a part of everyday life. In India, the violin was embraced into the world of Carnatic music. Held differently, resting against the ankle while seated, the instrument was reimagined. Its voice began to echo ancient ragas, imitating the sliding, singing tones of the human voice in devotional music. It did not replace traditional instruments. It adapted, and in doing so, became sacred. In the Middle East, the violin took on the microtonal scales of Arabic and Persian music, often replacing the rebab and Comanche. In the hands of skilled players, it could weep and wail with intensity, capturing the sorrow and beauty of centuries-old melodies. In the Americas, it joined settlers and slaves, weaving into new musical forms. In the Appalachians, it shaped bluegrass and old-time music, while in Mexico, it danced in mariachi bands beneath wide-brimmed hats and desert stars. And in jazz, the violin found freedom. From Stefan Grappelli's smoky Parisian improvisations to the raw power of Stuff Smith, the instrument once confined to courts now swung, improvised, and roared. Each culture tuned the violin to its own soul. Each gave it a new accent, a new purpose, a new place in the story. And yet, the instrument remained the same. 4 strings, a curved body, a wooden bridge, and something else. Something timeless. No matter the genre, the country, or the tradition, the violin kept one foot in history and the other in emotion. It could sound like a whisper or a wildfire. And perhaps that's its true power. The violin does not belong to any one place. It belongs wherever there is feeling. When the orchestra assembles, all eyes turn to the front, the place where the violins sit. Row upon row, their polished wood gleaming beneath the lights. Their bows rise in unison, ready to breathe life into the silence. In this world of sound, the violin wears the crown. It is the largest section in the orchestra, divided into firsts and seconds, each with a distinct voice. The first violins often carry the melody, soaring above the ensemble, agile and bright. The second violins, equally vital, weave harmonies and support, creating the rich tapestry of sound. At the head of it all sits the concertmaster, the lead violinist, and second only to the conductor. They cue the ensemble, tune the orchestra, and sometimes even take centre stage as a soloist. Their role is not just musical, but symbolic, a bridge between leadership and collaboration. Composers have long known the power of this instrument. From the quiet shimmer of Debussy to the thunderous storms of Mahler, the violin adapts, capable of tenderness or fire, simplicity or brilliance. In orchestral scores, it is often given the first word and the last. But the concert stage is not just for symphonies. Violin soloists have risen to become some of the most revered artists in classical music. Names like Jascha Heifetz, David Oistrakh, Itzhak Perlman, and Hilary Hahn have filled halls with performances that feel less like concerts and more like conversations between soul and string. They perform concertos that challenge the limits of emotion and technique. Tchaikovsky's aching melodies, Sibelius's icy fire, Beethoven's quiet majesty, all come alive when a single violin steps forward. The violin leads, it listens, it lifts, and when the orchestra swells behind it, the sound becomes not just music, but story. In the concert hall, under golden ceilings and velvet curtains, the violin has found its kingdom. It speaks in a language no words can match, telling tales of longing, love, fury, and joy. It does not need translation. It does not seek applause. It simply sings, in a voice centuries old, yet forever young. Centuries have passed since the violin first sang in the hands of an Italian artisan, and yet its voice has never faded. From palace chambers to crowded subways, from grand concert halls to humble village dances, the violin endures, not as a relic, but as a living, breathing soul of music. In an age of digital instruments and synthetic sound, the violin remains unchanged. It still begins as wood, cut, carved, and shaped by hand. It still waits in silence until touched by bow and breath. No batteries, no wires. Just tradition, tension, and the quiet power of resonance. New luthiers continue the craft, some in the same towns, even the same streets, as Amati and Stradivari once walked. They work not from mass production, but from memory, mentorship, and intuition. And players, young and old, still pick up the violin for the first time with a mixture of awe and reverence. Old violins, too, continue to live. Some are passed through generations, their varnish worn smooth by the hands of history. Others rest in velvet-lined cases, waiting for the right player to draw them back to life. A Stradivarius, built in the 1700s, can still hold a room in silence with a single note. But the violin is not confined to the past. It plays in film scores, in experimental jazz, in video games and virtual reality. It speaks to audiences who have never heard a concerto, drawing emotion from ears that don't know its name. Because the violin does not need to be explained. Its language is universal. A cry in one culture is a cry in another. A lullaby is soft in any tongue. And still, after all these years, the violin has one more miracle. It grows with you. A child's scratchy first notes become, in time, the song of their life. For the listener, too, it changes. What once felt bright might now feel nostalgic. What once was joyful might now bring tears. It evolves, not in shape, but in meaning. Because the violin is not just an instrument. It is a companion to emotion, a vessel for memory, a voice that never forgets. And as long as there is silence in the world, the violin will be there, ready to sing again.